Good morning. Welcome to Developing Microsoft Office and SharePoint Solutions in a Hybrid World. I'm Gavin Barron. Excuse me, I have a slight cough this morning. And I'm from New Zealand, so I talk a little bit strange. My co-presenter has a similar affliction.
Elaine Van Bergen, I'm from Melbourne, Australia. So we'll, if we start saying strange terms, please just jump in and stop us. And we might jump straight into the presentation. All right, so this morning we want to talk you through a bunch of the things that have changed in the SharePoint and the Office stack. So basically, if you've been doing SharePoint and Office development for the last few years, and you're still doing things the same way you used to, what's changed? Probably about almost everything. And we'll run through a bunch of the new pieces that you can start to use to try to make it easier to build hybrid apps. Because as we get onto these new techniques, it makes it a lot easier to leap into the cloud. So where were we, I guess? In the old world of developing Office applications and working with SharePoint and Exchange, it was very typical that you'd have to build completely different pieces of code if you were doing an Office app for Outlook versus an Office app for Word, or if you were connecting to a different version of SharePoint. Where we're moving towards, as we get into Office 2016, especially in the new SharePoint 2016 features, is we can now create add-ins which converge across all the platforms. So we can start to build single applications that we can work across everything without having to make code changes. That's even starting to include working in the iPad Office applications and the online applications, as well as those rich clients that you're used to working with. Now, certainly not all of those features you can do across everything today, but we're trying to work towards getting that really easy to do. Now, hands up if you think you're a SharePoint developer. Okay, good, good. That's my background as well, so we've got a few of those. What I would like you to try to think about is you need to make a mind shift. I don't want you to think about being a SharePoint developer anymore. The term I like to use these days is a SharePoint adjacent developer. So the whole point of this is rather than building all those web parts with 1,000 lines of code sitting inside SharePoint and all your business logic connected in there, we want to try to make the shift out to that extensibility layer that sits next to SharePoint and connects on into SharePoint and other features like an API layer. If you can make that shift and have it sitting there to the side, that makes it a lot easier than connecting to Exchange, to Skype for Business or Link, and also to make the move into Office 365. So we're not saying don't write SharePoint code anymore. There's still a bunch of that you'll be doing, but where possible, try to make that shift. Move outside the SharePoint platform and start building your code to the side. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through some of the demos.
So the more you can move your code to the side, the more you can reuse it in multiple different applications. And I'm a little bit lazy. I like to reuse things.
So one of the things that's very important as we go towards this is you are going to find a lot of things are different as we go across different versions. So we're going to show some demos and talk through bits and pieces. Now, you'll be able to use a bunch of these techniques no matter which version you're on, but it might be slightly different if you're dealing with customers that are on an older version of Office, for example. So it's very important that before you go in and build anything, you're right across whether or not you're doing Office 2010, Office 2013, or a mix of the two. Equally, with your SharePoint platform and other server platforms, it makes a big difference what version you're dealing with. In fact, not just major version, it's very important to know patch level. It's a very good example with a lot of the patches for SharePoint 2013. They've actually added in bunches of new APIs from Office 365 compatibility purposes that you can start calling. So if you're on an older CU, you won't have those functions available. But this session is all about code. So, we've gone through a few slides, but I think it might be time that we jump into a quick demonstration of an Office application. So let's switch across. There we go.
So what we've got here is an add-in for Office. Thanks, marketing, for changing the term on me last week. I'm going to get that wrong. I apologise. So we've got an add-in for Office here. It's a Word task pane app. It's built using MVC. If you don't know how to do that, I'll give you a few pointers on how you can actually make your experience in building add-ins for the Office platform a little easier than the default new app/add-in for Office. The purpose of this app is actually to reach back into a SharePoint site, in this case Office 365, and grab some information out for the user. We built an app a few years ago to help people compose up legal contracts that stored a bunch of legal terms that were approved by the lawyers on staff for the call centre staff to help them facilitate building out insurance clauses and media licenses and things like that. So let's just run this up and see what happens.
And I think we were going to make some of this code available later so that people, don't have to write notes as we go along.
I have to scribble notes. I'm going to publish this up on GitHub probably over the weekend. So what's happened here is on the default index page, I've got a little piece of JavaScript that goes, hey, if this guy hasn't got an authentication context against the SharePoint or the Office 365 environment we want to connect to, pop up a login page. And apparently, I've got some interesting trust settings going on. Now we see a login page here. You can see it says Contracts Add-in, and it's got a username and password box. This is an Azure Active Directory app that allows me to delegate the permissions to my SharePoint site, or mailboxes, or contacts, you name it. All right, can I get my password right? No caps lock. Third time's a charm. Cool. So what we're doing here is we're actually going to go through the OAuth explicit flow manually, compose up all the requests, get the bearer token, get the access token, use that to hit the discovery services, work out what we're allowed to talk to, get the root site resource to SharePoint, use that to compose up a request for a refresh token, which we can store locally in a database, and then replay that indefinitely over for up to 6 months. What's actually a rolling window of 6 months, provided you continue to use the application. So I've got a few scattered breakpoints here just so you can see what's going on. So first of all, we create this request that says, hey, I want to do an authorization grant type to redirect me back to my URL. Oop. I'll zoom in there. All right. With a redirect URI, which lives within my web application, a client ID and a client secret, the code that I've got back, so I've actually bounced through the first request into that site, and the resource that I'm after. I'll just F5 through that. In this case, we're asking for access to SharePoint resources. Now we're going to ask for the bearer token to the discovery services, and we're going to look through the set of resources that we've got back for the root site. And something's changed with Azure Active Directory. That's unfortunate. What should have happened is we would have got an indication of the root resource for SharePoint, which we'd be allowed to use that to make another request out to Azure Active Directory to get the refresh token. which we then stash in a database with some other information off that associated with that token, like the user it's associated with, the service endpoint it talks to, the ID of this, in this case it would be Microsoft.SharePoint, and the all-important refresh token. Now, with these refresh tokens, you want to be really careful. If you lose that, you've just lost someone's delegated identity. So don't go putting them in cookies, please. Please, please. Because they can be lifted really easily. We just save it into the database. Unfortunately, because this has crashed out, I won't be able to show you exactly what would happen, but I can walk you through it. The OAuth controller does a bunch of the heavy lifting for us, and then we have a couple more controllers that reach back in. In fact, our index controller, our home controller, has on its index route, it checks to see if it's got a cookie that indicates we have a refresh token, nothing more. Doesn't actually hold the refresh token, very important distinction. We grab the refresh token out of our database. We use that to make a call into a repository that we've built specifically for pulling back contract clauses. Compose up a REST request to SharePoint. If you've made RESTful requests into SharePoint, this shouldn't be anything too new. It's literally to my Ignite site using the lists RESTful API to find me license clauses. Do a little bit of processing. We return out, and just through the power of MVC, we put them out into a list, which the user could then click on any item in that list to inject that into the document and give themselves, a head start on composing their legal documents. I'm sorry that failed where it failed, but
well,
such is life.
At least we got the demo fail early, so we can move on to it.
Out of the way.
All right, we'll switch back to the slides. Okay, so some of the things that we can do with these Office applications is we can actually have that deployed into the online version of Office. And this removes a bunch of the deployment pain, so we can have it working in both ways. Now, I don't know if everyone put their hand up before saying they were a SharePoint developer. A bunch of that code probably looked pretty different to what you're used to writing. So we've put a link in this slide deck to some really good samples by Richard that you can actually walk through at a bit of a slower pace to be able to go through some of these bits and pieces. And there's a number of brilliant articles on the same blog that walk through other bits and pieces to really get you started and get going with those things.
Yeah, he works through 5 different approaches for talking to SharePoint from Office apps. From very, very simple to pretty much what I just showed you.
All right, so we're just going to jump back into some fundamental things that we want you to think about as we go through some of our other demonstrations. So the first thing is you've got to actually be able to have this, somewhere that you can set this up and have it going. Now that in itself is in fact a whole session by itself. So there was actually a session earlier in the conference, BRK 4104, that walks through setting up SharePoint to be able to do apps on that platform. Now, one of the bits that we'd like you to really look at is in that session, it talks a little bit about the low trust scenario. That's the scenario we're going to recommend, because if you can get things working in a low trust setup, that will make it a lot easier for you to make that transition to a hybrid scenario where you may need to interact with the cloud.
It's also going to future-proof you really well, because if you haven't heard yet, the preferred mechanism of authentication for SharePoint 2016 is OAuth. So low trust doesn't mean it's insecure. It just means that there's a broker involved and it's an OAuth style authentication flow. And if you can get started there, you're on the right track for moving forward.
Yep, absolutely. One of the other things you're going to want to do is you're going to want to start playing with Office 365. Now, last week as part of Build, they announced a great program for this where you can actually sign up and get a free dev tenancy for a year. You used to have to pay money to get that, but now it's free. And along with that sign up, which is at dev.office.com, you also get sent a whole bunch of samples and newsletters and things to really help you get started. So definitely jump on board with that one if you haven't already. Also, as you go through, you would have noticed that in that demonstration Gavin did, he jumped through a bunch of different code files, and they were set up to be different modules based on the different activities. So we really want you to think about, rather than that old model where you grab server-side APIs and have everything tightly coupled, try to connect into services. In the example we show, we're using the REST services to be able to do some of that connectivity. There's almost equivalent functionality available there. Then we want to separate out a bunch of that logic and have that sitting as a logic layer by itself. And then in those scenarios, and we'll get into one in our last demo, where you may need to have some specific code per platform. Perhaps you're writing for an older version of Office and you might need to switch that piece out. Still going to have to do that in a lot of situations. Just keep that code to a minimum and really try to segment that off if you can. Also, there's some amazing samples up on the patterns and practices. Hands up if you've used a bunch of the samples. Oh, wow, I thought everyone would put their hand up. There's only about half the room.
Hey, it's open. Who's submitted some samples or worked on some tidying some stuff up in there? Excellent. So I would really encourage you guys to grab a hold of it, fork the project. If you can, get involved, submit some pull requests, but it's really good stuff.
Yeah, I've got to admit, when you first look at it, there's so much there it can be a little bit overwhelming. One of the new models we have to get used to is how fast everything changes. So don't think you need to download all the code and get to know every single piece. What I tend to do is I just triage the monthly announcements and go, what are all the new things that are in here? And kind of file that away as a list of things that when I hit one of those tasks, I then go, great, I need to do some responsive design. I'm going to dive into that sample and use that as part of my code and do that deep dive then. So it's rapidly evolving on a monthly basis, and it's literally part of the regular workflow for my team where they look up there and go, what's new? Can I use it? Will it speed my development up? And the answer is always yes to that. Some amazing stuff up there. The other thing we want you to think about, it's always been a really big challenge, especially with SharePoint server-side development, to make things testable. One of the great things about the approach we're suggesting, where we go through with modules and separating things out, connecting to services, is we can actually do testing, unit testing and other features fairly easily now. So please make sure you put them in there. It's also really important because we're starting to deal with an evolving platform, particularly with the online services. We're going to start to have a lot of changes come through, and we want to be able to change our code to keep pace with those new pieces. And if you don't have the testing in there, then you're very nervous, obviously, about making those changes. Also, we typically move into minimal viable product, where you're going to want to deploy the minimum features you need to get going, and then add on new features as you get through that cycle and deploy it as well. So to do that, you need a reporting and logging layer to know A, what went wrong, and B, which features you should invest more time in.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things I want to touch on in this area. Testing's a really big thing for me, and it's proven its worth time and time again. Now, those of you who have been playing with the Patterns and Practices library, something you possibly don't know is SharePoint's tested against that stuff. So if you're using the patterns and samples in there, you know that that's a tested scenario, and every build of SharePoint is actually tested against that. The other thing you should really think about is whenever you're creating a new project in Visual Studio, checking that application insights box, just checking the box and figuring out where you're going to store that data gives you a huge, rich amount of data for no work at all and a minimal cost. So highly encourage you to look at that.
Also, we want to think about deployment right from the start, right? We really want to be able to deploy often. As we talked about that minimal viable product approach, you're going to want to pushing out changes to these all the time. As part of that, we want to make sure you're going to include all the setup components and also that you're testing it in a way that matches the destination. So, it's quite surprising in this day and age how many people I see still running as domain admin with their SharePoint setup, writing code that way. It's just going to function completely differently when you deploy to a client. So get that security context right and think about those patch levels. And in fact, you're likely to need multiple environments for many of your customers where you've got different SharePoint farms, different Office setups to be able to push that through.
I'd actually encourage you to stop having Visual Studio installed on your SharePoint servers. Unless you have to do full trust code for a very bizarre corner case now, you don't need to. So please think about, and it just makes your life so much better. You don't have SharePoint consuming resources underneath you. So, think about your development environment. Start pushing code on day one. Start pushing code up into the cloud. Start pushing code locally. Think about, can I set up a continuous deployment system off this? Git deploy is a wonderful tool, and you should. Chris O'Brien spoke earlier in the conference about a lot of ALM practices around Office 365, and I'd encourage you to take a look at what he said.
Yeah, and another good benefit of this is if you can get that working, deploying often, and you're working from Visual Studio without SharePoint, your dev laptop can literally be a Surface. You don't need one of these big, machines that you need to carry around all your SharePoint VMs.
This is a relic of SharePoint development. I will be happy to see it go.
Although you do have to start going back to the gym now that you don't have to carry it around all the time. All right, so I think we're going to jump into another demo. We just want to show a quick sample of basically how do you provision some of these artifacts. When people do provisioning, we find that a lot of times people focus on just getting a site set up. When you think provisioning, we want you to think about all the artifacts, and I think we're going to show some list items going in.
So in the demo that didn't quite work, what we were going to show you was a bunch of license clauses that came out of SharePoint. You can see in the recent gutter here a bunch of lists and libraries that have been set up via an app provisioning approach. And in our license clauses, we've got a number of license clauses. Big surprise. But this has all been created using CSOM and the patterns and practices approaches. What is a little bit different about it is that it's kind of old school. I actually had, the column definitions and the content types sitting around on an old dev server. So what I did was I cheated. And I went and grabbed all of the camel.
I think we call it leveraging your investment.
That's right.
Sorry, that's the technical term for cheated.
Yeah, being lazy because I'm a lazy developer. Went and grabbed all of the camel declarations for the fields, all of the content types. And who's seen the old school data row importer? Yeah, that camel's been there, was there too. Now, normally you wouldn't want to touch this stuff with a barge pole because it's going to tie you to a full trust solution or a sandbox solution. But the patterns and practices guys have done a lot of really good work here. And what they've actually done is they've put wrappers in so we can actually inject XML strings. And literally I've got this gigantic monster of a file that will run through create site columns by reading that site column definition up into memory, using some link for XML to pull out the bits of those files that we care about in individual pieces, and then use this wonderful new extension method, add fields as XML, and just drop it straight in. The same approach holds for the content types. The lists, I had to make a little bit of a little stub library definition and use those to spin up the libraries and then bind the content types to them. And then I also injected the content from that XML. So let's just run that up. So one of the things about deployment is it should be repeatable. And not just repeatable on machine A, B, C, D, E. It should be repeatable on the same machine with no negative side effects. Now, I use a little tool because I don't actually know what my password is. No idea. Wonderful UI here. Click the button and it's going to run through the code. And it's going to take a wee while to churn through it because there's actually a fair bit of XML there. So everything going well, I should have had breakpoints hit. Demo gods are not kind today. So you're not going to see the breakpoints that I wanted to walk through, but that's the nature of the beast some days. You just don't get treated kindly by the demo gods. But if we go back over to our SharePoint site, cool. So my lists and libraries have finished running. My weird trust thing that I need to sort out keeps popping up. You can see that my libraries are still there. They haven't been affected by this at all. If I go into the content types, they're properly defined. There's no problems there. So these are the sorts of things you want to think about with these patterns. Can I do it again and again and again and not have an unintended side effect creep in?
Yeah, nothing worse than hitting that button and all of a sudden all your libraries are gone and you had content in them that you wanted to have stored.
Yeah.
Definitely you need to know what's going to, it needs to do that in a graceful manner. There are times when you may need to clear everything out, but typically you want to have that as some kind of switch or something so you don't, accidentally just pave everything in your whole site.
Yeah. You might even think about, setting up a web API layer that you just call into manually that reaches out and wipes those things using an app-only permission. Cool.
Awesome. So let's jump back. All right, so as Gavin mentioned, it's very important that it's a repeatable process. And by repeatable, we don't just mean you can run it against different machines. You should be able to run it again and again with the same kind of process happening. Also, we saw that even though there was a lot of XML in there because we were leveraging the investment from an older sample, it was using non-declarative ways to be able to provision those pieces. That means that you can work with the online version as well as on-prem, but also it gives you better error handling. I think we've all battled against having those XML deployment methods go away and you just get, there was an error somewhere and you spend ages trying to debug that through. This will actually show you where the error is happening. Also, there's a whole session that was earlier in the conference on some deep dive techniques into provisioning. So that session number's up on the screen. And also we provided a link to a sample but from Vesa as part of the P&P content. So there's some good references there if you want to do some more of this provisioning techniques. All right, the next topic we're going to talk about a little bit is authentication. It's definitely something that can make or break the user experience. If you get this wrong and users keep having to authenticate again and again and again to your application, they're pretty quickly going to want to shut that and close it down. There's definitely a few different options that we can use. So we can pop up a screen, or we can look at doing single sign-on, or you can use some of the default sign-in methods. Typically, we're looking at the pop-up screen. You have a bit more control and a bit better branding if we want to. Yeah.
That little frame that the Office add-ins live in, if you're in a task pane app, that's not going to be a very good place to try and get your users to enter their username and password. So the pop-up screen actually does rule supreme here.
Especially if you're on a smaller device, trying to enter your little username and password in a little task pane doesn't really work.
Single sign-on's even better, but small devices, BYOD, that sort of stuff falls by the wayside. So think about both scenarios.
Yeah, and then storing some of those tokens so you don't need to sign on again and again as well, as we showed in one of the other demos. So we've got some different things that can help with these different pieces. One that actually Gavin had in his first sample was around the ADL libraries to allow for secure authentication. Now, these allow you to authenticate in a secure manner from client-side applications. Now, again, we could spend the whole session just purely talking about these guys. So instead, we put a link into a bunch of samples and documentation that will walk you through how to use a lot of those pieces. Now, they're only for the Office 365 APIs at this time. And, you know, generally you might use them for single-page applications, but you can also use them across a range of different things. And as we've expertly shown, authentication is probably one of the trickier things where you kind of get a few bugs and weird pop-ups happening, and we're having a trust issue at the moment, as you can see. One of the things that really helps debug some of this flow, because it goes through a lot of jumps just to be able to get authenticated via OAuth, is actually a Fiddler OAuth inspector that Kirk Evans has written. And definitely have a look at that hyperlink up there. It's a little inspector that sits inside your Fiddler, and then you'll be able to see a lot more information on the JOT tokens that you're getting through. Another little thing that I wanted to talk about as well is the Azure AD proxy connector. Has anyone had a play with this one yet? Ooh, wow, okay, so this looks like no one's had much of a look at it. It's actually released in preview at the moment, so it's not necessarily something you want to roll straight out into your production applications, but definitely something you want to have a look at. What this allows you to do, as you can see in this diagram, is we can authenticate off Azure Active Directory and then have that flow through to our on-premises applications, and we don't have to separate that authentication through. And I'll show a little bit some of the steps that you go through in your Azure tenant to be able to set this up. We'll also have a link later with the full steps to walk through.
So
very easy.
What I'm hearing here is no more need to set up ADFS and reverse proxy craziness that I have to go to the IT pro team cap in hand going, please sir, can I have some access?
I'd say this is so easy a developer can even configure it. You don't need the IT pro to worry about any of those pieces. Just don't tell them. Another really cool thing that you can use along with the combination of some of these features is Azure AD dynamic groups. Now, given there's a lot of SharePoint people in the room, you're probably familiar with audiences. Audiences don't secure things in SharePoint. They kind of just allow you to hide and show content. Dynamic groups is a similar concept, but it's an actual real security group that we can use to set proper security against pieces. Now, there is a little caveat on this. You need Azure AD Premium to be able to use this feature, and I'll show you where you can turn on this feature once you've got it set up. But it's very minimal cost really for that feature, and then you can go up and set up these groups using rules and all kinds of complex setups, and it will actually recompile them very, very quickly. None of the old audience targeting where it might take 24 hours to move someone in and out of one of those audiences. You can also use them to control who has access to different apps, and that's the scenario I'll show where a particular app shows up in my apps config because I'm actually in an Azure AD dynamic group.
So the Azure Active Directory proxy that we just talked about as well, that also requires Azure AD Premium. But well worth it.
We're going to throw this one over here, and sorry, I think it's a little small on the screen. So I've got a very simple Azure setup here. Basically what happens is if you're in your portal for Office 365, you already have Azure AD set up. You just may not know that it's actually sitting behind the scenes. So if you want to connect to this functionality, you want to scroll right down to the bottom. Under Admin, you now have the Azure AD link. Now, the first time you click on this, other than asking you to authenticate, it will also ask you to set up an Azure account to be able to do some of the other different pieces that you want. So you can just go up and set a normal Microsoft account in there that'll allow you to do some of the bits and pieces. And then it will prompt you as to whether or not you want to enable Azure AD Premium. And I've actually already gone ahead and done that piece. What you get is you get a 90-day free trial. This is brilliant for playing around as a developer on these pieces. 90 days is actually quite a long time to play with these pieces. So I've gone ahead and done that. And then I can see down here, this is actually my directory. This whole tenant that I'm using was set up using the Microsoft Demo Builder. So basically I hit a few buttons, configured a tenant, put 25 users in there, and then I've just gone through and done the extra bit to hook it up to a trial Azure setup. So in the directory here, I've got a number of things, and we'll look at groups first. So if I go through and I could add a new group, we'll just call it Ignite Demo for now. And then on that particular group, I can click through and I can actually configure it. You can see with this preview feature, enable dynamic memberships. Once I turn that on, it gives me the capability to do some of those clauses that I mentioned earlier to set up the conditional membership. So I can, of course, do an advanced rule if you want to get into very, very complex features, but most of the time, you're just going to do a simple rule. So a good example would be maybe I want to make sure that the given name starts with a particular letter, S. Now, one of the caveats is if you do use the default rules up here rather than advanced setup, it's actually case sensitive when it's doing those compares against the fields that I'm pushing in there. So that's one thing that certainly tripped me up. Right, so that's then gone through and it's set up that group for me. And then if I go over to, well, it should in a little while, hopefully. No, it's not going to like me. I should probably set it to display name, not given name. I think then hopefully we'll get a few features in there. There we go, if I set the right property. So you can see already that was pretty quick, right? I've only got, like I said, about 25 users in this tenant, but it's already put those users into that group, and then I can go through and use that group in different areas, and we'll show that in a little bit as well. There's a lot of other properties on these groups we can play with, but we'll just stick with the dynamic ones. All right, so then the Azure AD proxy piece. If we hit configure on the directory over here, you'll see now that we're starting to get a lot of different options as to how we configure Azure AD. One of them is quite nice, customized branding, for example, if you want to set up some nicer branding on those features. If we scroll down, though, past all of these pieces, we have a new section called Application Proxy. What we do is pretty easy, hit the Enable button on that one, and that turns it on. Then we can go through and actually hit Download on this connector and put it onto a machine. That will then walk you through the entire process of configuring the Azure AD proxy and connect it up to this Azure AD tenancy. Now, to be able to do this, we do still need the on-prem environment to be configured correctly. And in this instance, what you're typically going to have to do is have your SharePoint environment configured with Kerberos to be able to delegate the credentials through. The blog post that we're going to link to actually goes through all the steps of doing those pieces. And in fact, about 80% of the blog post is how to configure SharePoint and Kerberos and all the other pieces. And there's about 3 steps on how to do the Azure AD piece, because that's the easy bit once you get all those other pieces going. Then the final bit that we need is if we look at applications. So as I mentioned, we wanted to try to authenticate across into a, in this case, we're going to do a SharePoint site sitting on-prem. So what I've done is I've gone through into applications and I've clicked add, and I did that earlier just so you didn't have to watch me type. And very basically, I've got a demo site set up. All it is a URL. This is not an app. I didn't open Visual Studio, none of those pieces. I've just gone add from here, entered my details, and set my pre-authentication method to Azure Active Directory. Then I go through, and down the bottom here is where I then have my access rules. And in my access rules, I can pick the groups that I want to be able to authenticate and connect on through to this piece here. One of the things that trips me up is actually search. If you need to search for something, it's that little icon there, and then you can type it in and be able to search through that list of groups and click add, and we've then added that group with access to be able to come through here. So that one connects that through. What we then get, I better hit save before I go across to the next screen, and just saves through. That'll take a second. Under users and groups, I'll then start to see some functionality there where it's starting to display who has access. And if I go over to groups, we can see that as well. So what I need to do is, you can see this assigned column here. For people to be able to use it who are in that group, I actually need to also assign them to that in that screen there, and then that pushes it through and makes it available. Also, as we mentioned, you need to be on Azure AD Premium, so the users that are going to come through this piece, you'll need to license them as Azure AD Premium. Now, what we then get to see is under My Apps, I've actually gone through and pinned it already, that demo site. So all that is a URL linking through to my on-prem SharePoint that will authenticate me through. Nice little feature, I think, for being able to set up that hybrid when you don't need that full search connectivity. I just want people to be able to go to the intranet and link back from my extranet team sites or any of those features. Really nice, easy way, I think, personally, to configure that up. All right, so we'll flick on back to our slides. Oops, I forgot we didn't flick machines, my bad. That one.
Yep.
All right, so that was a really fast run through a lot of those features. You know, I don't expect many people to be able to remember that, given it's still 9 a.m. on a Friday. But we've put some blog posts in here that will walk you through these different pieces. So the first one there is an ADL sample by Andrew Connell to how to do the authentication pieces that click on through for a single page app. I think that sample is there.
So it's all, that one's all in JavaScript, nice and current, if you like.
Yep, Andrew's got some great content where he walks through and really explains how it connects on through. The next post there is the Azure Active Directory blog post by Kirk Evans. Steps you through every single setup, talks through what he has from a SharePoint setup, how to configure Kerberos and get all the on-prem environment ready, and then clicks you through the settings for Azure Active Directory and setting up that proxy feature. Then the final one is about dynamic groups and how to utilise them by Victor Weiland. All right, so let's jump on to our next topic where we talk a little bit about SharePoint integration. I'm getting a lot of questions about should we rewrite our entire code to SharePoint apps? Is full trust code going to be deprecated in 2016 or future version or anything like that? Full trust code still works perfectly well. If you have an app that is running on SharePoint or whatever it is that's running on SharePoint, it works fine. You don't need to make any changes. There is no reason for you to go in and to rewrite that using the app model or replace it with different bits and pieces. That being said, if you have to make a rev to it anyway, if you're doing a major refactor or you're starting something new, it certainly makes sense to try to use some of the hybrid techniques there if you can.
Yeah. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if you're thinking about moving to the cloud, you're probably and you need to get that content up into the cloud, you might need to think about some of the techniques that exist for pulling those full trust solutions out of your farms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of the things we suggest is trying to avoid sandbox solutions. Certainly if you can move away from using those, that's one area that's going to be a big problem if you wanted to move to the cloud. You don't want to be picking that piece. And if you are using farm solutions, you just need to understand what the impact of that is. It's completely fine to have it still running. You just need to make sure your code's in a reliable manner. One of the things that really helps for trying to work out how to do these migrations is if you look at the SPCAF Migration Assistant tool. You can basically run it across a bunch of your code and it'll give you some really good guidance on how easy it would be to update. And what that means is you can then perhaps pick some of that low-hanging fruit and go through and slowly make the shift to some of these pieces as you're going through and doing refactoring or adding new features anyway, rather than a wholesale shift to try to use these new techniques.
Yeah, there's a bunch of really good material up on MVA and in the the Office Dev training materials repository up on GitHub as well.
Yep,
Walks you through those.
Yeah, and I think there was a session on a bunch of that earlier in the conference as well, BRK 4111. So that should be recorded. So with SharePoint, we want you to think about it like an API layer. try to drop out of using that server-side object model. We really want you to look at using REST APIs or other techniques to be able to connect on through. Moving towards using that allows you to do a single application that you can then shift across to use Office 365.
You know, I would encourage you, if you still have things that you have to use server-side code for, you know, maybe you're running an older version of SharePoint and for some reason you're not going to patch it and you need to do updates to user profiles because of user actions. Maybe you want to write that as a small service layer that you drop inside SharePoint, or you could possibly use SP services to do it client-side. But yeah, think about these ways you can stop dropping code in, and if you have to drop code in onto your SharePoint boxes, think about minimizing the surface area of it.
Yeah, and so that's a really good suggestion. If you're on an older patch level and you don't have some of the REST functionality you need, or maybe you're on SharePoint 2010, you can still use the same approach. It just means you might have to use one of these samples or put your own services on there to get that moving. As we move towards this different model, though, it is a brain shift for server-side developers. Usually when you write server-side code, you know the server's already there. with client-side, with connectivity to REST services and different things, you may find the response speed is variable at different times, or the connectivity drops out at a particular point. So we have to start writing our code in a way that handles those pieces. And again, there's a lot of people that have been doing this kind of connectivity for years, so there's a lot of good samples out you can use for those bits and pieces. Also, some people are saying, hey, let's rewrite everything because we are going to move to the cloud, maybe in a year or 2 years' time. While it's good to use some of these new techniques and move to services and separating our code out, keep in mind your on-prem SharePoint environment is completely different to Office 365 in most situations that I've seen. Typically, you're going to use Windows claims, and up there it's going to be SAML claims if you're in SharePoint 2013. Very few of my customers are running hostname site collections, and probably your SharePoint farm has just 1 or 2 bits of custom code installed, or 20 or 30 or 40.
I don't think I've seen a SharePoint farm without any in a long time.
Yeah. So your environment will be very different to Office 365. So that doesn't mean that you're going to be able to automatically pick and shift your code up into the cloud. Also, you may not want to. The speed that Office 365 is evolving at, there's new techniques we can use there every day to save a lot of our time. So I wouldn't preemptively rewrite something on the premise you're going to move in a year's time. Equally, if you're building new, it makes sense. Use the new techniques, but don't assume that it's going to just shift up to the cloud.
So this is an awesome diagram that we've lifted with Kirk Evans' blessing from his blog. This is what I think is a wonderful architecture for your new cloud-ready hybrid solutions. Now, when you write a SharePoint app, you get an access control token from ACS if you're doing those low-trust apps, which I'd encourage you to do. It's not the same token as you would use to connect to Office 365. And as we saw in my demo fail, I actually made a call to Office 365's Discovery service to find out what I had access to in that collection of resources. Now, what this architecture pattern suggests is that instead of putting all of the responsibility into your SharePoint app to handle the management of all those keys and reaching out to all the various services, perhaps you want to roll a custom web API layer that takes care of that. Any guesses why you might want to do that? Because it seems like just a lot of extra work, right? Well, okay, so I decide to start consuming some of these services first in my SharePoint application. And then the boss comes along and says, hey, that's really cool. We could put some of that into my iPhone. Oh, but it's in here. If I've got that separated up into a web API layer that actually takes care of that ACS point separately, hey, yeah, sure, boss, you guys can start calling into that. You'll just have to handle authentication against that endpoint, and that's it. It's a really nice pattern for making sure that, as you start moving to the cloud, you're really enabling everybody else in the organization that you belong to or that you're working with to move fast as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because there are, some of this is complex. You're not going to be able to jump on board without, walking through some of these features. And you may have developers in your team that are going to really struggle with this concept. But if you can look at this kind of isolation, you only need a couple of people to be able to build this piece. And as you said, the rest of the team can jump on board and just kind of consume some of those features and do the UI layer or the other easier parts.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of interesting SKUs on this one. When we do traditional SharePoint application or SharePoint app dev,
Add-in dev?
Add-in dev? It doesn't quite roll off the tongue the same. When you go to that website, first of all, that website actually accepts anonymous access. A little bit interesting. Try it out sometime. Just go straight to it. It'll load fine. Anyway, when you launch it out of SharePoint, you get sent to that site with a bunch of stuff stuck on both the request URL and in the post to it that actually is used by the SharePoint context helpers, so the token helper and the SharePoint context helper, to construct up your authentication mechanism. But there's a scenario where you have an app that maybe it needs to request permissions on the fly, instead of just having that fixed list of permissions. So that's what I'd like to show you next in my demo.
Flick across to that one.
Cool. So what I've got is a simple application that's sitting here it's just running on localhost. I'm just going to jump over quickly to my SharePoint site. Here's my SharePoint farm. Now, the first thing I did before I started any of the build of this was to go into the app reg new. Actually, the first thing I did was set up load trust. But assume that you've set up load trust. It takes a little bit of work. Once you've got that set up, go into app reg new. It gives you the ability to generate a client ID and a client secret and put in the return URL that will be used by the app that you're registering. Right. So, my application that's running here, it's just running anonymously at the moment, and it says, hey, click here to authenticate against your on-premises SharePoint server. We're going to do the OAuth dance again, but this time it's a little different. So the easiest way to do this, and outside of the context of a SharePoint application that you've gone file new SharePoint application, do file new SharePoint app, grab the two key files of SharePoint context and token helper out of there, and then you're going to want to set up a whole bunch of settings in your web.config that are going to help you throughout your site everywhere here. So just quickly pull up my web.config file. Pull up the right web.config file, not the wrong one. And we can see here that I've got the client ID and client secret from app-reg-new, the redirect URL that I want my authentication chain to come back to. So that's just a controller that's wired up within my MVC website. The SharePoint site I'm going to go hit, and the realm. Now, the realm there is really important. Without getting that in, this is all just going to blow up in your face, and you're going to be going, what does this mean when it says ACS can't establish the realm of trust? You can pick this up as you set up the low trust setup. All right, so I'll just jump back to my breakpoint here. So this is going to kick off to SharePoint and ask for some permissions on the fly. You can see here I've actually just hard-coded them into this request, and I'm going to ask for read access to the web. So instead of deploying an application into SharePoint to say that's the trust that's going to be set up there, this app's going to request it on the fly. Kicks my browser off into the SharePoint site. Let it read items in the site. Let it access basic information about the users of the site. Okay, that seems fair. I will call out that the server here is running inside the firewall of this organization. It's not out in the cloud because there's a few challenges with trying to get back through. When we've come into our auth controller here, basically checking to see if we have an existing authentication context at all, and then we're going to call into this OAuth helper that just does a little bit of... Oh. Awesome. My keyboard shortcuts have changed. There we go. All it does is literally construct up a request to get a refresh token. And in this one, I'm actually being naughty and putting it into the cookie. Bad developer. So the site's come back and said, hey, you can just close this dialog and refresh the Office add-in because it's designed to go into an Office add-in. It's not there yet. I'm just going to click back on the home page. And in this case, it's going to... What the heck? Oh. Apparently I didn't press F5. I pressed something else. It's going to grab the bearer token that it needs to create some authentication against the site, make a query against a list that lives within my SharePoint on-premises farm, and grab some information about some photos so we could start to construct up a photo gallery. Real simple example, but quite powerful. You can see how you might use this for allowing people to connect in and on ad hoc basis, which requires a lower deployment area into SharePoint. And for Office add-ins, this is an approach you're probably going to need to take, or you're going to have to deploy a small stub app into the SharePoint sites that you want access to. Either works. Why have I just drawn a blank? I've completely drawn a blank. All right.
Are you going to switch it over?
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. So some of the pieces that we've seen in that demo is trying to use some of the the ACS functionality to be able to connect on through.
That's what I was going to show. Now I've regained my train of thought. I'll go back to where I was. So we can jump it back. Sorry about that, folks. Now, if you look in the solution here, you can see I've got an MVC website and nothing else. I was also connecting into an on-premises SharePoint farm. Now, one of the things I like to think about is how can I change out things nice and quickly if I need to. Now, you can see where I was actually connecting into my on-premises SharePoint farm. I have this on-premises image repository, which is an iImage repository. Now, if you know anything about Unity, who's heard of the Unity framework? New dependency injection framework for .NET, which allows me to go and define another repository that implements the same interface and quickly switch it out with very minimal effort. So literally, it would be one line of code in my setup, which is in my app start, Unity config, where I literally register the concrete type I want for that particular thing. And that handles just injecting the particular image repository required into the controller that I'm using. Now, if I want to take my nice work, personally, I think working inside the frame of the Office app is a little painful, and I like to leave that for the last minute possible. So, does anyone know the little trick here? I should actually leave this open. Convert to an Office app form. So if you just right-click on your project, hit convert, and you can turn it into an Office app or a SharePoint app very easily. And personally, I think that's a much richer and stronger way of composing up your apps rather than starting with an HTML and JavaScript frame only. Mm-hmm. Cool, thanks.
Okay, so one of the things that we showed there is the ability to be able to have some abstraction in there, in this case using Unity, to be able to switch between different versions in a particular point in the code. And what that means is you can effectively have the one kind of project that's going to be able to run against both different scenarios. Also, quite a nice tip of being able to build it very simply in Visual Studio to start with, and then switch it into an Office app later as you get towards that end cycle and you're ready to start to kind of test it on through. And one of the, we talked about trying to allow for limited connectivity, and there's also a blog post via Kirk Evans that we've linked through into there that'll step through a bunch of these steps in a bit more detail to be able to connect on through. All right, so we're getting towards the wrap-up of the session, I think. So some of the things that we've shown you are a bunch of new techniques that you can use. We've talked about trying to use REST services and trying to separate your code out into layers. Now, of course, we've all been doing that for normal .NET development for years, but certainly some SharePoint developers, not all, have got into that bad habit of putting all their code right there in the web part or right there in the page that you're building, rather than separating out those layers like we traditionally do with a .NET application into services, logic, and web kind of layers. So I really want you to think about trying to do those pieces and move away from tightly coupled code. As Gavin mentioned earlier, try to not deploy Visual Studio onto your SharePoint server. If you deploy it onto your client machine and connect on through to SharePoint, that really starts to force you to use some of these new techniques, and you're kind of getting ready for when you shift towards the cloud. It does also mean that if you're using these new techniques, a hybrid application becomes a lot easier to build as well. We also talked about, as things are changing, especially in Office 365, you're going to want to put in a lot of the new features. Maybe your organisation changes some of the security setup or different pieces. So you need to be able to iterate and deploy often. We want to make sure you get that testing in there, get the reporting, whether that's App Insights or some of the other features in there, to be able to record some of what's happening in your application and making sure you can iterate and change based on that. Also, if there's ever a doubt on how to do some code for SharePoint or Office 365, have a look at that Patterns and Practices project up on GitHub. Now, it's actually called the Office 365 Patterns and Practices, but the large majority of it, you can actually use the same techniques on-prem, and there's really good guidance in there as to what you can use and what you can't use.
It's got some really good approaches to managing different versions, and actually walks you through how they've set their project up to handle the various versions that it targets.
Yeah, and a lot of when you look at the patterns and practices as well, you'll see a lot of the people that we've linked blog posts through, they're actually contributors to this kind of project, the project up there as well. So one of the things that you can do is, if you need a bit more information on those, pretty much all the guys are on Yammer in the Office Technical Network.
There's a Yammer group for us dedicated?
Yep, and it's quite amazing. I have the feeling that some of them don't sleep. The speed that you get responses back when you start to post comments to a lot of these guys, it's quite amazing the information that you'll get back. And certainly, you know, there's webcasts and all kinds of things to really step you through trying to use some of these pieces and get across how to do them. Cool. Is there any?
No, you keep stealing my thunder, Elaine. I should be used to this by now.
All right.
Thank you very much, everybody. Please evaluate the session. It's really important to us. And we've been asked if you, as you leave, stick to the doors on the left as you're heading out. Thank you.